distributions of texts via manuscripts in South India. All yours, Dr. Sukanya. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for that introduction. Namaskaram, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking Swamiji for having me here and all the organizers who made sure that the coordination went smoothly. Without further ado, let me share the screen. As you well know, I'm going to talk about Kṛṣṇa, the magician flautist. Let's just give me 2 seconds. I'm just while I try to fiddle with this thing. No, that's not what I want. Okay, it should work now. Can you see the slides? Yeah.
Yes, visible.
Okay, good. Right. So, I thought I should begin by reading out to you a verse by Periyar, which will hopefully set the tone for this talk, as he describes the intense expression on Krishna's face as he plays the flute. Siruviralgal tadavi parimara sengan koda seyyavai kuppalika kuruvayar puruvam kudalippa kovindan kulal kodu udina podu பறவையின் கணங்கள் கூடு துறந்து வந்து சூழ்ந்து படுகாடு கிடப்ப கறவையின் கணங்கள் கால் பரப்பிட்டு கவிழ்ந்திறங்கி செவியாட்ட இல்லாவே. So when Govinda played the flute, as his little fingers stroked and moved about the flute, his red eyes squinted, his red lips puckered, his eyebrows with little beads of perspiration overhung his eyes, flocks of birds abandoned their nests, came and surrounded him and lay motionless. Herds of milch cows spread out their legs, hung down their heads, and remained unable to wag their ears. So Krishna's plays are numerous. We know many of them, most of them perhaps. The Dashamaskandha from the Bhāgavatapurāṇa tells us so many of his stories, of his plays. And he also has many skills, and he has performed many exploits and many acts of grace. But I think that perhaps his playing the flute is something that fits into all these categories, as hopefully I will show today. As a matter of fact, it has become iconographically so very important that it is one of the most identifying features of Krishna. I think perhaps that's why if we think of Krishna, many of us would simply remember his image as playing the flute. And even if we look at the modern day interpretations, actors, for example, like NTR, if you see him as Krishna, he's often seen with the flute at all times, even in the most irrelevant context. Perhaps the flute is for Krishna what the bow is to Rama, something that really identifies him. So the Sanskrit Puranas, like the Bhāgavatapurāṇa, but also the Vishnu Purana, and the Tamil Arva poetry and texts like those go into raptures describing this fluting talent of Krishna's. And the second millennium Tamil literature, especially the 2 Tamil renderings of the Bhāgavatapurāṇa, are no exception. And I'm actually going to focus especially on these 2 in this talk. I might refer to other non-Tamil material, but these are the 2 main sources that I'm going to use. So which are those 2? So the first one, I've already given a talk, I think, about these 2 in this August presence. So I won't get into too many details. Both of them were supposedly composed in the 16th century. The first one, perhaps slightly earlier, by Sivai Suduvar, who probably was a smarta. He closely follows the Bhāgavatapurāṇa, the Sanskrit original, and he has slightly less than 5,000 verses, whereas the second one was clearly a Sri Vaishnava poet. He lived in the late 16th century, and he doesn't really, he follows, of course, the Bhāgavatapurāṇa, but he's a lot more free. His work is more like an encyclopedia. He gathers all Krishna-related stories and dedicates a few verses to them. So these 2 are the 2 poets that I'm going to focus on today while discussing Krishna's flute playing. So what's the plan today? So the plan is I'll begin by focusing on the mesmerizing power of Krishna's flute playing. We all know how mesmerizing it can be, but I'll give you concrete examples. This talk will, especially this first part, will be more descriptive than analytical, but I think that it's actually worth it. And the second, and then I'll move on to show that it's not just mesmerizing people is perhaps not the only aim that Krishna has. We will see in the second part that it has also a salvific effect. So if we go back to this verse by Periyarva that I read out a minute ago, we can see that Krishna has started playing the flute. And in this verse, we already can see in the last two lines that creatures around him have started reacting to his flute playing. We get the reaction of the birds and then also of his own cattle. So let's see who his audience is in the other Bhagavatas, the Tamil Bhāgavatas, and what they undergo and how they are completely attracted by the music, etc. So that's the plan for the first part. So this is a verse in the Sevai Suduvar Bhagavatam. So Sevai Suduvar dedicates a verse to Krishna's own cows that he grazes. They are his foremost privileged audience. We all know that they are the closest companions that he has other than his own friends, human friends. So, Tirita kandru vai vaita vammulai una, tirandu kalitta pulluna karavai, pungarpaha sengir murikurungavin kavatriya muhir nagai sivvai, marai kurundin veyin misai anjavi madutte. So the frolicking calves did not drink from the udders they had lipped. The milch cows did not eat the clump of glab that they had nibbled, drinking in by their pretty ears the sweet flute music of the Vedic sprout with red lips and buds like teeth that cause sorrow to the plump beauty of the red-hued sprouts of the flowering kalpaka tree. Okay, I'm not going to get into the fact that Krishna's mouth is rivaling the beauty of the kalpaka tree and its sprouts and fruits and whatnot. I'm just going to focus on Krishna's audience. And in this case, as I said, the animals that he is grazing, they are stunned into forgetting to eat what is already in their mouths, and which is a real rare occurrence in real life. Once you place food in an animal's mouth, you can be pretty sure there's very little that can bring that out. I know that from a personal experience. So these cattle, though, are quite different. Why do they do so? Well, the poet gives a hint here, because they are at the same time drinking in with their ears the sweet flute music. So they are busy taking in something else. So perhaps they're not quite so keen on anything else. Perhaps they're feeling full already. Now, this verse echoes the Bhāgavatapurāṇa verse. I mean, echoes are there everywhere. I'm just going to quote this one from the Bhāgavatapurāṇa, not too much. So I'll just read out the translation. It says, the cows, their ears pricked, were also drinking the nectar of the flute music coming from Krishna's mouth. The cows stood transfixed with their mouths full of milk from the dripping udders. Shedding tears in their hearts, they caressed Govinda with their eyes. So we can see here that the flute music is not just food for their ears, it's nectar. Why is it nectar? Presumably because it comes straight out of Krishna's mouth. And in that case, how could just grass and mother's milk satisfied after drinking in that nectar from Krishna's mouth? Well, there you go, you have your answer now. But then, was it only these domestic animals, these Krishna's gentle Sattvika cows that are affected by his music? Well, perhaps not. We've already seen that Periyarva mentions the birds. And here Arunaladasa, the other writer of the Bhagavatam in Tamil, lists all the birds that turned up as soon as they heard Krishna's flute music. So I'll just read the translation. Quails, peacocks, doves, bush miners, prattling parrots, swans, long cranes, pelicans, the joyful angel birds, flocks of large herons, fledglings, along with Asunam, all these came quickly. So you can see, just imagine the place just invaded by all the animals, all the birds that ever exist surrounding Krishna as soon as he starts playing his flute. Just a quick note on this. Perhaps you don't know what this is, Asunam. Asunam is mentioned in the Sangam poetry in Tamil. It is believed to be a creature, and I think perhaps a bird-like creature, which apparently was very susceptible to harmony, and which was fascinated by the notes of music. So when hunters wanted to catch it, it was virtually impossible. So what they would do is play very nice music. And then when it's completely transfixed, what they did is suddenly produce drum beats. And it just died almost of a heart attack because that contrast was unbearable for it. So I think here, adding this bird here shows that Krishna's music was pretty good. So there you go. But of course, he had no intentions of killing them off or catching them. So, we saw cattle and then the birds. So is it just harmless birds like these ones that are attracted? Well, not quite. You can see that wild animals, ferocious animals, are also attracted to this music. So I'll read the translation here. Elephants that shed musk like rains, male lions, tigers, herds of deer, all joined together as one species, looked at the elephant-like man who stood with a bamboo pipe and stood melting like drawn figures, hearing that music. So we can see that ferocious wild animals are in a trance as well. And even animals that cannot, in the natural state of things, cohabit with each other, actually we find them together. Well, this is a very common thing to find. I think the predator and the prey, the tiger and the deer, for example, drinking from the same pond, is a story that is found in many types of texts and oral traditions. For example, I think it's in the Mahabharata. I think it's in Madras country. They say that the lion and the deer drink together. And also in some of the ashramas we have seen, you have this ascetic who has so much sattvika, who's sattvika guna that creatures around him live in peace and harmony. So in this case, I think in those cases, well, those animals are submitted to the king or the sattvika guna's power of an ascetic. In this case, the animals are subdued simply because they are mesmerized. They are controlled by the divine music of Krishna, thanks to which their own essential nature has become modified. We will see more and more that all these animals and these people we are going to meet in a minute or so, their essential nature just changes as soon as they hear this mesmerizing, magical music. Anyway, we can notice that earlier on we heard, I think Professor Mishra mentioned a picture, like a portrait. They are like a portrait. So we have the same idea echoed also in these writings. We can imagine that they're stunned, they're motionless. All you see is paintings of this scenery of Krishna playing and all these creatures just stunned by his music, which perhaps reinforces the idea that the poet here, also his colleague, I would tend to think, is trying to paint an idyllic portrait of the countryside during Krishna's concert. Okay, now, Arulala Dasar also quotes, makes a list. He likes making lists everywhere that I've seen. He makes also a list of wild animals that are there to listen to Krishna's music. And here, he speaks of hogs, lions, tigers, elephants, shiny sheep, buffaloes, bears, etc. And later on, he mentions the snake as well. So Dasar describes them as having stopped blinking, and they start listening intently to this music, and they are totally melted by this music. So I think here perhaps what we need to note is that this list includes animals that are considered less noble. Obviously, hogs and buffaloes are clearly less noble than an elephant or a lion, for example. But what we need to remember is that perhaps it doesn't matter what animal it is, predator or prey, noble or not, Krishna's music affects them all equally. Just as his grace touches everyone and everything equally, Krishna's grace or his music does not and cannot discriminate. So we can see that here. So Dasar actually, as I said, also adds the snakes. I haven't given it here. He says that the snakes stood transfixed. They stopped dancing and they're just stunned in this list. And it's interesting because Sirve Sudavar also picks out these the snakes in his own verses, and two types of snakes, actually, the one that live in this human world. And he calls them the cruel, fiery-mouthed, poison-pouring snakes emitted good nectar. Once again, we see them changing their nature. I mean, they don't willfully change their nature. It's just that the music changes their nature. almost automatically. But what is perhaps more surprising is that the music reaches all the way, it goes all the way to Kailasa, where Shiva's snakes are also affected. So we can see here, the serpents adorned upon his body perform dance, listening to the undiminished music uttered by the bamboo pipe of the Supreme Lord. So we can see here that whereas some snakes are stunned, they were dancing and then they stop, these snakes, Shiva snakes, start dancing because they're so mesmerized, just as a snake would dance in front of a snake charmer due to that pipe. So Krishna has become that snake charmer here, I think. And it makes me wonder why he even bothered to use violence to submit Kalia, right? He could very easily have just played his flute and Kalia would have submitted. Well, anyway, he probably had his reasons that we don't know anything of. Right. It's not just animals, but also trees and plants, the fauna, but also the flora that is affected by Krishna. And in this case, it's actually dead trees who spring back to life. So we can see here, due to the music fashioned by the Lord with the fiery discus with round rims, dried trees put forth leaves. Well, this is hardly surprising, I would say, since after all, even the trees showed emotion when in the Ramayana, Rama left. Rama was about to leave, I think, Ayodhya. Valmiki says, Abhivrikshaha parimlanaha. Even the trees withered. So it's hardly surprising that in Krishna's presence, thanks to his healing music, divine healing music, they come back to life. I'm not saying they are the same trees, but hey, why not? So there you go. So from the examples we have seen and the examples we will see, we can clearly see is that nothing seems to follow the law of the nature. Why is it so? Well, perhaps because the maker of those laws is in Kṛṣṇa now. He's in total control now. As a matter of fact, we can see in the next few verses that even the elements themselves, the Panchabhutas, etc., they too act different or even against their own nature. The sun and the breeze, meaning it's the sun and Vayu, for example, the sun turns into something very cool, whereas the breeze turns into something very hot. Okay, admittedly, it's only for the Gopis who are suffering from viraha. That's there in Kavya since, I don't know, since time immemorial, that women in love find the cool breeze burning. But still, you can see that the sun has become cool, whereas the breeze has become hot. So again, everything seems to change. But is it only on this earth? Well, not clearly not, because we've already mentioned Shiva's serpents that change their nature. But actually, even beyond this world, and not just the serpents, many other beings, superhuman beings, shall we put it that way, are also affected by this music, as we can see. So Arunala Dasa actually gives a list. Once again, as I said, he gives many lists. I won't go through all of them. Here he quotes all the dancing, celestial dancing women like Rambha, Urvashi, etc. He says that they actually get so flustered that, and they also start melting like wax on fire, etc. And here you have a slightly more exalted list of people, beings like Gandharvas, Yakshas, Kinnaras, and Kimpurushas, etc. So those people, Arulala Dasa says, they simply drop their instruments. We know that the Vidyadharas, the Kinnaras, etc., they were musicians. They are divine musicians, celestial musicians. So they drop whatever instruments they had. They were just stunned. Well, it seems that Krishna's magical music makes them all stop whatever they were doing, whatever they were good at, and draws them towards him, because he's the only person who actually masters them, whatever they may think about themselves and their own talents. And we can also see that they totally forget themselves. And they also react in different ways. Some are completely stunned, some get agitated. So I think Krishna's music has different effects depending on the person. So the thing that we can carry on towards the next is that, well, it seems to me right now that Krishna is actually almost like the Pied Piper, you know, except that he doesn't have any bad intentions. The list doesn't stop here. And we have greater deities being affected by this divine music. Okay, is it going to change? Yes, it is changing. We have Indra and Shiva also deeply moved to tears here. Indra is described as shedding tears here, and Shiva is also described as shedding tears, which is actually a little bit funny, I think. He says, the joy that filled the heart of him who is half woman brimmed with pure water and flowed, joining the long fiery eyes, so that it is, meaning the fire, became extinguished. So we know that here Shiva is known as the Ardhanarishvara, which means that if he's shedding tears, it's likely that he is shedding tears, but also his wife from the other half of the body. So both of them are shedding tears. They are so moved. But another thing that is funny here is that the poet says the water that comes off their eyes actually extinguishes the fire from his third eye. I don't know, how can it go up? Well, maybe that third eye is also shedding tears. Or God knows, maybe the gravity actually works differently in Kailasa. I don't know. But this thing happens anyway. So it seems that their shedding tears is truly a purificatory act. We can see here pure water, he says, for the tears. And this purificatory act that will cleanse them of their blemishes. What blemishes could gods like that have? Well, perhaps from a Shiva Vaishnava perspective, ahankara, for example, and mamakara can be washed away through these tears that come out of pure bhakti. So this is the case in Indraloka and in Kailasa. Now, in Satyaloka, a marital crisis is happening due to this music. So let me read this out. The lady whom the flower-born four-faced Brahma delighted in embracing left his tongue and began to learn dancing well, hearing the music emerging from the flute holes. So you can see that the goddess of arts, who's said to live on her husband's tongue, so that in order to enable him the recitation of the Vedas so that he can create, and who's also said to dance upon the tongues of the eloquent people, she has decided to leave his tongue and his embrace, and in order to go and learn to dance properly, thanks to Krishna's music. So clearly, people who thought they were very good at what they did, the best in their own field, whether it is Apsarases or the divine musicians or Saraswati, well, they realize that there is a master above them who is actually has so much to give them so that they can learn. So perhaps we can even speak of the educational role played by Krishna's music. Now, if these people can be so moved, do we even have to speak of the gopis? All the poets write many verses about the effect of the flute on the gopis. Obviously, I cannot quote them all. This one I picked because it has an echo to one of the verses that I already read. So this one says, even if tiger and deer began to behave like one species due to the flute music of Krishna, who is like the neck of big peacocks with long tails, the breeze tiger of a slow gait that coils around the flowers fought with the deer-like gopis with pretty black curls with blossoming jasmine. So we've already seen that the real tigers and the deer are united by the magical music of Krishna. It's as if they become one species. But here, the breeze, which had already turned hot, has also turned into a tiger. This is something that is also imagined by Kamban. So this poet is just repeating what Kamban said. So this horrible tiger turned breeze is attacking the poor gopis who are losing all their self-control and who can't stand 1 minute of viraha. They can't stand 1 minute of separation from Krishna. So as I said before, listeners are either stunned or they get agitated. The gopis actually get first stunned and then agitated because they want to rush. We'll see more of it in a minute. It just shows that Krishna's music affects everybody. Nobody is left indifferent. The way it affects is different. So it seems almost like, during the pralaya, it is said that Narayana absorbs all things towards himself, and he swallows them to keep the whole thing inside his tummy. Similarly here, he's like a magnet that attracts everything and everybody towards him, and he uses his music for that. Anyway, the Gopi, this takes us to our second part, because as soon as we move into the Gopī domain, we also see the salvific effect of the flute music. And here we also enter the domain of the individual. So of course, I'm going to mention the groups. We've seen birds and animals and wild animals and whatever. Now we're going to move to the gopis and sometimes very particular ones. How much time do I have? I still have a few minutes. So, so the gopis hear this music and they get stunned, and then they get agitated because they want to reach Krishna, because clearly the flute music is so attractive. It's almost like a summons to them. Everybody manages to get there, except perhaps one woman, one gopi, who's not quite so lucky. Or perhaps she's the luckiest of them all. You can tell me later on. Here's Arulala Das, and I'm mainly going to use Arulala Das's verses here. So let me read this verse. When women with increased love ran, their thick black locks hanging down, their hearts melting, the mother of one woman, who became scorchingly furious, reached her quickly and held her by both her hands. With that, she did not know how to reach him. So you can see that one girl has been caught. And how does she react, do you think? Does she cry like Indra and Shiva? Is she stunned? Not quite. Let's have a look. நந்தந்தன் மைந்தன் பாதலன்களை நினைந்து நைந்த சிந்தையள் உடலின் ஆவி அரியடி சேர நேரில் அந்தரத் தமரர் பூவின் மாரிகள் பொழிய ஆன்ற சுந்தர விமானம் ஏறி துலங்கிய கெதியில் புக்காள். The soul from the body of she, whose thoughts were wounded thinking of the goodness of Nanda's feet, reached the feet of Hari. As the immortals from the sky poured showers of flowers, she climbed upon the very pretty aerial car and entered the effulgent heaven. So thinking of Krishna's padam, she's taken to Paramapadam. Oh yes, she sheds her body. She is Cintayantī. She is famously known as Cintayantī, as we shall see. She goes to a world where she can be unfettered and she can give all the love she has to give him as much as she wants whenever she wants. Here I'm tempted to think of the mother as a metaphor for samsara that tries to hold on the jivatma back and keep it to itself. And the flute comes as a savior because it allows her to go beyond all this prison. Exactly. So, so with this notice, I think the salvific nature of the flute, it brings one very close to Krishna indeed. If not when he is in incarnation close to him, then at least close to him permanently in Vaikuntha. And the poet doesn't stop here. He has another verse to describe this. Meditating upon the effulgent feet, which cannot be seen even by those who perform countless severe austerities, tapas, fostering red fire, or by Brahma on the big fragrant lotus, she, becoming the contemplative woman, Cintayantī, reached the good heaven that rises greatly. People other than her lost it. So this girl, without doing anything, really achieved what those who perform countless acts of austerities, I don't know, karma yoga, jnana yoga, etc., as mentioned earlier on, she got what they could not even imagine, despite troubling themselves so much. She managed, the slip of a girl managed to get it so very easily. And as I said, she's referred to as Cintayantī, the woman who contemplates. Now, this lady is, her story is a popular one among the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas in the 13th century, 14th centuries, and also later. Many of them mention her. For example, Nampillai calls Nammarva as Dirgha Cintayantī because his contemplation lasts much, much longer. His suffering lasts longer and that sort of thing. Arage Manavala Perumal Nayana, who's a younger brother of Pillai Lokacharya, makes a list of 21 people whom Bhagavan accompanied on their path to liberation. He mentions very cryptically, because these are sutras, Idaichi, the cowherders, so it's a reference to Cintayantī. Whereas Pillai Lokacharya gets, a bit more detail. He lists her among people who died for the sake of Bhagavan. Now he says, Jatayus and Pillai Tirunarayur Arayar abandoned their bodies. For Cintayantī, her body left on its own. Now, who is Pillai Tirunarayur Arayar? That's a Sri Vaishnava Acharya. He was a priest, I think. And when he was visiting, I think, Tottiyam Perumal temple, somebody had put fire to the murti of Perumal. So he actually threw himself onto the murti to save it from damages, and in the process shed his own body. So Pillai is trying to show that these people gave up voluntarily their body. Jatayu, he gave up his body while fighting Ravana, whereas for Cintayantī, it happened on its own. Now, it's very interesting because Manavala Mamunigal, later on, I think it's later in the 14th century, he gives her story while commenting on this sutra, in which he unpacks the process through which you obtain moksha. It's not as easy as the Bhagavata writers presented, because there's a process. It's not just that she thought of him and he got moksha. She got moksha. It's a bit more complex than that. So he's going to explain that. Okay, this is what happens here is, this is his commentary on the verse, on the sutra that we just saw. He begins by quoting verses from the Vishnu Purana. So what I'll do now is just quote and give you the translation of the Vishnu Purana verses. How much time do I have? Oh yeah, I do. 5 minutes. Read out these Vishnu Purana verses, and then, they themselves are self-explanatory, and still if we need, I'll also read the translation of this. So here's her story. One saw her elders outside the house. So, staying indoors, she closed her eyes and contemplated Govinda as if she were as one with him. The bliss she felt in doing so released her from the faults that she had acquired. Her anguish at not seeing Krishna freed her from her sins. Contemplating the creator of the world in the form of the highest absolute, another of the herder's girls won liberation just because she sighed so deeply. So the story, the original story, presumably is in the Vishnu Purana, not in the Bhāgavatapurāṇa, perhaps why Sivesudava doesn't mention it. So what does Pranavada Mamurigal say on this? He basically let's just read the translation. He basically just re-explains this in modern, not Tamil, Manipravala, so that it's easier to read. So he says, as said in the Vishnu Purana verses that I just read, on the day of the sacred Kuravai dance, hearing the music of his sacred flute, she set forth in order to go to Vrindavana, but seeing the elders, she stood back, unable to go. And she had all her merits, punya, and sins, papa, destroyed through the faultless joy that came from having her thoughts gone to Krishna by meditating upon him, and the limitless sorrow that came from not obtaining him, respectively. As memories of him went on, her breathing stopped, being unable to survive due to the sorrow of not obtaining him. Therefore, her body left her in such a way that there was no need for her to give it up. This is what he means, he says. As you probably know, we pay for our happiness with our punya, which keeps decreasing as a result. And we also get rid of our sins by undergoing sorrow. So this Gopī, who could not go to Krishna, was so sad that she lost all her papas. But she was so ecstatically happy at listening to this flute music that she lost all her merits. So her account of papa and punya became neutral. And that's when liberation occurs. Probably this is the point of view of the Sri Vaishnavas, that punya is just as bad as papa, perhaps even worse, because it prevents us from getting liberation. And worse, it gives us so many good things that we want to stay back in the samsara. Anyway, this episode tells us about the power of Krishna's music, the music that he produces with his flute. The kind of bliss that it produced is narrated here. As I said, this is not related in the Bhāgavatapurāṇa, so Sivesudava doesn't have it, but Arulāla Dasar has it. Both the verses from the Tamil Bhāgavatas that I quoted here are from a chapter. Both of them dedicate a whole chapter on Krishna's playing the flute. But surprisingly, I found something like extremely surprising, that he actually, this poet, Arulāla Dasar, actually has another separate chapter which he calls Cintayantī Padalam. And here, Cintayantī becomes, the Gopī, the cowherdess, becomes one of the Rishi Patnis. And I still don't understand why, because he calls her Cintayantī already in the other episode, and he calls this episode as Cintayantī, and Cintayantī is one of the Rishi Patnis. You probably know the story of Cintayantī. Krishna goes to graze his cows, and one day he's very tired and hungry, so he sends his friends to go and get some food from some of the rishis who are performing some kind of yajna, they shoo them away, they go away. So he sends them again to their wives, and those women are very, very happy to bring that food. And it's described here, they made all sorts of flavored food, and they fill them in pots to the brim, and they want to bring it to Krishna themselves, except that their husbands try to call them, catch them up, and they even try to rush after them, they scold them, but the women are cleverer, they just disperse and go to Krishna, except for one woman. This poor woman who was really bewildered is caught and tied up by her husband, who's really angry, so that she cannot go to Krishna, and she actually perishes. You can clearly see the parallel between Cintayantī, the cowherdess, who was stopped by her mother, and Cintayantī, the Rishi Patni, who stopped by another member of the family. Both of them want to go to Krishna. Both of them are desperate because they can't, and the body goes. And again, we have a very similar verse by the same poet within a few verses distance. He says, the poets rejoice, saying that it was amazing that the woman should reach the supreme abode of Madhava, which is not seen despite performing perfect sacrifices, that's yajnas, giving many excellent donations, dana, even to those who afflict their bodies, performing hard penances, that's tapas, for an immeasurable length of time with nothing but air as food. No point in doing all these things. No, what matters is the kind of bhakti, deep, desperate bhakti that you feel that is going to change the game and take you all the way to the eternal presence of Krishna. Because in this world, it's not going to happen. You have to go to Vaikuntha. A few concluding thoughts. So we see that both poets paint an idyllic portrait of the cowherd's hamlet as Krishna plays the flute, and he impacts and perhaps attracts thousands of creatures, gods, humans, fauna, flora alike through his flute playing. Krishna's music has a summoning role, as we saw. It attracts, it mesmerizes everyone and everything, as if it were not just a flute, but rather a magic wand wielded by the great magician of all that Krishna is. And the music has different effects, as we saw, upon its audience. Some are stunned into becoming motionless, as we saw. Some become agitated, some cry, some rush towards him. We also saw that, unsurprisingly, Mayon's irresistibly enchanting music has salvific effects as well, perhaps for the best among them. And the best is not based on whether they have a superior birth or not. It's based solely on the depth of their devotion, which is perhaps why I think that, it gives, as I said, it grants moksha. I think that his flute playing is not just a skill, because we can see he's better than many people at art, but also one through which he performs many exploits, such as captivating everyone. And it also acts, it's also an act of grace by liberating the most deserving, I think. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much again, Dr. Suganya. Wonderful talk. And you kind of, what should I say, brought the flute and his music almost alive. Okay, it's wonderful. I say almost alive because, I had to kind of look at a lot of other things as part of the background support for this. So was able to listen into 99%, but not the 1% balance. Apologies for that. But it's really wonderful yet again. I like the right in the beginning, of the talk, you likened the flute